Welcome. You're listening to Detective Duo, bringing you tales from the golden age of mystery, adventures in the spirit of Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. Tap subscribe to stay with us and share where in the world you're listening from. The morning had begun with the kind of bluster that made London seem determined to blow away all sense of order. The wind rattled the windows of the Beresfords' flat in South Audley Street and sent the curtains billowing like sails in an indecisive sea. Tuppence, wrapped in a blue dressing gown and fortified by tea, presided over the breakfast table as though it were a war council. A scatter of envelopes lay before her like a defeated army. Bills, circulars, invitations of varying degrees of dullness. Tommy, opposite her, was engaged in the slow destruction of his toast, cutting it into geometric fragments before consuming them without enthusiasm. "Do you realize," said Tuppence, waving a gas bill, "that this one alone could finance a small revolution in the Balkans?" "I'm already revolting," murmured Tommy, "against the principle of breakfast-time arithmetic. Pass the marmalade, old thing." She ignored him, turning to the next envelope with the relish of a pirate expecting gold. Circular, 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 and, oh, something deliciously odd. Tommy looked up. The envelope she held was of heavy cream paper, yellowed at the edges, and addressed in a spidery, uncertain hand. There was no return address, no postmark beyond a faint London district stamp. The flap had been sealed with old-fashioned wax, now crumbled. Tuppence slit it neatly and unfolded the single sheet inside. A faint scent of age, dust, and something indefinably tragic rose from the paper. She read aloud, her tone shifting from amusement to intrigue. What was hidden in Postern Lane must never be found. For God's sake, destroy this. There was no signature. They stared at each other across the breakfast table. Outside, the wind rose in a brief howl, as though it too had overheard something it ought not. Tommy broke the silence first. "Well, that's nice and comforting for a Thursday morning. Do we know anyone in Postern Lane?" "Not yet," said Tuppence, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "But we soon shall." He groaned. "Tuppence, I distinctly recall promising myself a quiet month. The agency's closed, remember. Blunt's brilliant detectives are on indefinite furlough." "That's exactly why we must investigate," she said briskly. "Idle minds breed mischief. It's either this or I take up macrame, and you know how that ended last time." Tommy smiled in spite of himself. "I still have the scars from the experimental lampshade." She turned the letter over thoughtfully. No signature, no sender, but look here, darling, a watermark, Langley Court. It sounds beautifully sinister. Hampshire, perhaps, or Wiltshire. One imagines fog, ivy, and genteel decay. "You would," said Tommy. "I imagine the heating bill." But Tuppence was already on her feet, moving to the writing desk by the window. Outside, traffic moaned faintly through the wind, and the scent of wet pavements drifted in each time the window rattled. She held the paper up to the light, her expression sharpening. "It's old, Tommy, very old. Look at the grain, the ink. Someone wrote this decades ago, and yet it arrived today." He raised an eyebrow. "Posthumous correspondence, that's a new one." "Or someone has kept it, waiting for the right moment." Her voice dropped. "And whatever they hid in Postern Lane, they fear it might be found." Tommy leaned back, folding his arms. "There's a far simpler explanation. Someone's confused us with the local clairvoyance society. Honestly, Tuppence, we're not in the habit of chasing ghosts." But the protest was half-hearted. He knew that look in her eyes, the gleam that had carried them through coded messages, stolen jewels, and at least 3 murder investigations before breakfast. "Tell you what," he said, reaching for the newspaper. "Let's consult the Oracle of Fleet Street before we go gallivanting off. Maybe Postern Lane's just had a new fishmonger or something equally sinister." He shook the pages open, the paper crackling like dry leaves. For a few minutes there was only the sound of rustling print and Tuppence's thoughtful hum as she reread the letter. Then Tommy stopped, his hand freezing midway through a turn of the page. "Well, listen to this." He read aloud. "Fire destroys abandoned estate on Postern Lane, Hampshire. Local authorities report that the derelict property known as Langley Court was engulfed in flames late last night. Cause unknown. No casualties reported." The room seemed to still, the wind's moan outside rising to a plaintive whistle before subsiding. Tuppence sat down slowly. "Langley Court," she repeated. "Tommy, That's the same name as the watermark. He exhaled. Coincidence. There's no such thing, she said softly. Not in our line of life. She picked up the letter again, smoothing the creases as if they might yield more meaning. It was posted in London, but refers to something hidden in Hampshire, and the house burns down the same night. That's no accident. Tommy studied her face, half exasperated, half admiring. You've already decided we're going, haven't you? Of course we are, don't you see? Whoever sent this was desperate. For God's sake, destroy this. That's not a phrase written lightly. He sighed, folding the newspaper. All right, Mrs. Beresford. Suppose we do investigate. What's the first step? We start with Langley Court. The postmark's too faint to trace, but the Times mentions Hampshire. I'll telephone the county library, pretend to be a writer researching local history. You mean we'll drive down, get caught trespassing, and have our names dragged through the mud again, Tommy muttered. Tuppence smiled serenely. Adventure keeps the complexion young. He gave up, pouring himself more coffee. Fine, but if we end up in a haunted ruin, you're the one negotiating with the ghosts. By noon, Tuppence had produced a small notebook filled with notes, a map of Hampshire, a list of nearby villages, and one circled name, Woodley Magna. That's the parish for Postern Lane, she announced triumphantly. A charming little spot, according to the librarian. Nothing ever happens there, which is, of course, exactly why something has. Tommy set down his cup. We'll need the car serviced, and I'm not driving through Hampshire storms on sandwiches alone. If you're planning a resurrection of Blunt's brilliant detectives, at least let's do it in comfort. She kissed his cheek lightly. That's my sensible husband. As she gathered her things, the letter carefully folded into her handbag, Tommy glanced once more at the newspaper photograph of the charred ruins. The blackened chimneys of Langley Court jutted against the grey sky like broken teeth. Beneath it, a caption. Local rumours persist that the estate was cursed following the disappearance of its last resident, Dr. Simeon Vale, 30 years ago. He frowned, then looked up at Tuppence. Ever heard of a Dr. Vale? She shook her head, though her expression turned thoughtful. Not yet, but I suspect we soon shall. Postern Lane, Langley Court, and a letter from nowhere. It has the flavour of a mystery with good bones. He rose, straightening his tie. Then let's hope the bones aren't literal. As they left the flat, the wind flung a handful of rain against the windows, and the door clicked shut behind them. The forgotten letter lay momentarily exposed on the desk, pale against the dark wood, before the next gust of wind lifted one corner as if in farewell. By the time the Beresfords' motorcar turned onto Park Lane, the London clouds had drawn together like a conspiracy, and the rain began to fall in earnest. Tuppence watched the droplets chase each other down the window, her thoughts racing ahead to Hampshire lanes, ruined houses, and secrets that refused to stay buried. Somewhere between curiosity and foreboding, she smiled faintly. Postern Lane, she murmured, half to herself. Let's see what you've been hiding all these years. Tommy, gripping the wheel against a sudden gust, shot her a sidelong glance. And if it's trouble? My dear, she said, her voice calm and bright, it always is. The road to Woodley Magna wound through a countryside that looked as though it had been painted in muted watercolours, soft greens and patient greys, the occasional church spire pricking through the mist like a punctuation mark in an otherwise tranquil sentence. Rain had left the hedgerows slick and shining, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet earth. Tuppence Beresford, her hat pinned at a defiant angle, leaned forward eagerly as the car rounded another bend. I do love an English village that doesn't want to be found, she said. It's always the ones that look so innocent that are hiding a body or two. Tommy, concentrating on the narrow lane, gave a dry snort. Let's hope they're properly buried by now. These roads weren't built for the motor age, let alone for sleuthing couples. On the contrary, Tuppence replied cheerfully, they were built for secrets. Look at those trees like they're conspiring. He followed her gaze. The oaks and beeches pressed close to the lane, their wet leaves whispering in the breeze, giving the illusion that the road itself was listening. Ahead, a crooked signpost leaned at an angle that suggested exhaustion more than neglect. Woodley Magna, Tommy read aloud. Population reticent, I presume. The village appeared suddenly, as though conjured from the mist. A scatter of stone cottages huddled together around a small green, the thatch on their roofs silvered with damp. Smoke curled from chimneys and a dog barked lazily in the distance. The church tower, grey and dignified, watched over it all like a patient sentinel. Tuppence sighed with pleasure. Perfect, positively begging for a mystery. Where's the inn? They found it at the far end of the green, a stout timbered building with a swinging sign that read the King's Lantern. Its windows glowed amber against the grey afternoon. As they drew up, the smell of peat fire and stewing onions drifted through the door, and Tuppence declared that even the most cunning of criminals would have to wait until after tea. Inside, the inn's parlour was a study in English comfort. Low beams, red curtains, and a collection of porcelain dogs staring out from the mantelpiece. Behind the bar stood a woman of ample build and sharper curiosity, polishing a glass as if it had personally offended her. "Good afternoon," said Tuppence brightly. "We'd like a room if you have one. My husband and I are spending a day or two exploring." The woman's eyes, quick and canny, flicked from Tuppence to Tommy and back again. "Exploring, are you? Not many come to Woodley Magna for that. Nothing here but hedges and history." "That's exactly what we're looking for," said Tuppence. "We heard something about Langley Court. Such a tragic fire." The woman's hand paused mid-polish. "Ah," she said after a moment, "Langley Court. You've heard, then?" "Only what was in the paper," Tommy said casually. "Terrible business. Wasn't it the old Vale place?" Mrs. Cotter, she introduced herself between the arrangement of keys and the production of tea, leaned on the counter, lowering her voice as though the brass dogs might eavesdrop. "Dr. Simeon Vale, yes, historian, scholar, and according to some, mad as a March hare. Lived out there alone after he and his wife separated. She kept the little cottage by the roses on the far edge of the village. Kept to himself mostly, though folk said he had visitors at odd hours, men from London, secretive sorts. Then one night, 30 years ago, he just vanished. Police came, poked around, said he'd gone abroad. Only he never did." Tuppence's eyes sparkled. Vanished. How deliciously mysterious. Mrs. Cotter seemed both pleased and scandalized. Mysterious, maybe, but not wholesome. My mother said that house had bad luck built into its stones, and after he went missing, no one would buy it. It sat empty until it went up in flames last week. Tommy accepted his teacup with a nod. "Any idea how the fire started?" The woman shrugged, her lips pressing together. "They say lightning, but I've never known lightning to strike 3 times in the same place. Some folk say it was cursed. Others say it was just time catching up." She looked around before adding in a whisper, "And there was talk, old talk, about something he'd hidden, some relic from the war, a list, a weapon, who knows? The soldiers came through here often enough back then." Tuppence leaned in. "A hidden relic, you say?" Mrs. Cotter straightened, realizing she'd said too much. "Oh, just village gossip, Mrs." "Beresford," Tuppence supplied with a smile. "And this is my husband, Thomas. We're terribly fond of gossip, aren't we, darling?" Tommy muttered, "Positively addicted," but his tone held affection. A moment later, a gust of wind banged the door open, scattering a handful of leaves across the floor. Mrs. Cotter tutted, went to close it, and as she did, Tommy caught sight of someone standing just beyond the threshold, a tall man in a dark coat and hat, the rain gleaming on the brim. The figure paused, then turned sharply and walked away down the lane. Tommy rose and moved toward the window. The man's pace was brisk, almost deliberate, his outline soon swallowed by the mist. "Expecting someone, Mr. Beresford?" asked the innkeeper, returning to the bar. "Not that I know of," he said lightly, though his eyes stayed on the lane. "But perhaps someone was expecting us." Tuppence joined him, peering through the glass. "Oh, he's vanished. I do love a good vanishing act. It makes everything feel properly dramatic." Tommy sighed. "You're incorrigible. I suppose you'll want to go traipsing after him next." "Tomorrow," she said firmly. "Today we have tea and tomorrow we explore. I want to see Langley Court, or what's left of it, before anyone sweeps away the clues." "Clues to what, exactly?" "To whatever was hidden in Postern Lane, of course." Her voice softened, almost thoughtful. "There's something in the air here, Tommy. Can't you feel it? Like the village itself is holding its breath." He gave a small laugh, but not entirely comfortably. "All I can feel is the damp. Still, you may be right. There's something off. The way Mrs. Cotter stopped talking when she realized how much she'd said. The fellow outside, and every soul we passed on the green staring as if we'd brought the plague." Tuppence took a sip of her tea and smiled. That's what makes it perfect. A village full of whispers and a house full of ashes. Tomorrow, we'll take a walk up Postern Lane and see what secrets Hampshire keeps. The rain had ceased by the time they finished supper, leaving the night sharp and cold. The lamps of Woodley Magna cast warm circles on the slick cobblestones as the Beresfords strolled briefly before bed. The church bell tolled 9, its echo rolling softly across the fields. Tommy paused by the lane leading out toward the countryside. The darkness there was thick, the hedges bending over like watchers. "That must be Postern Lane," he said. "Charming. Remind me again why we don't holiday in places with electric light." "Because," Tuppence said, slipping her arm through his, "we are incurable romantics, and because the best mysteries never happen in the sunshine." Behind them, the inn sign creaked faintly in the wind. Somewhere down the lane a dog barked once, sharp and sudden, then stopped. When they turned back toward the King's Lantern, a light flickered briefly in an upstairs window of the house across the way. It blinked out almost immediately, but in that second Tommy thought he saw the silhouette of the same tall man, motionless, watching. "Tuppence," he said quietly, "I don't think we're the only ones who came looking for Langley Court." She squeezed his arm. "All the better, darling. Mysteries are much more interesting when someone else wants to solve them first." They went inside, the door closing behind them with the soft finality of a secret keeping itself. Outside, the mist thickened over Woodley Magna, wrapping the village in silence. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves along Postern Lane, whispering to no one and everyone all at once. The dawn came pale and reluctant, creeping across the Hampshire hills like a secret that had no wish to be told. Mist clung low over the fields, softening the sharp edges of hedgerows and hollow lanes, and the smell of wet ashes drifted faintly on the breeze. Tommy Beresford, hands deep in his coat pockets, surveyed what remained of Langley Court. The once proud house stood, or rather leaned, in mute ruin, its blackened walls jutting up from the ground like the bones of some long-dead creature. The air still carried the faint scent of smoke and charred timber. "Well," he said at last, "I'd call that a fixer-upper, but I think even the estate agents would blush." Tuppence, beside him, drew her scarf tighter. Her expression was thoughtful, not dismayed. "It's wonderful," she murmured, "exactly as it should be." "You have a strange definition of wonderful," Tommy said dryly. "Half the chimneys are missing and the other half are trying to fall on us." "Precisely. Look at it, Tommy, the atmosphere, the tragedy. This is where something important happened. You can feel it." "I can feel the damp," he countered, "and possibly pneumonia." But she was already stepping forward, her boots crunching on the brittle remains of what had once been the grand entrance. The door hung half off its hinges, and soot streaked the cracked plaster like finger marks. Inside, the great hall was eerily silent except for the occasional creak of settling debris. A half-burnt portrait still clung to one wall, its subject, a stern man in academic robes now haloed by smoke stains. "Dr. Simeon Vale, perhaps," Tuppence whispered, studying it. "Or someone equally grim," Tommy replied. "Remind me again why we're here at dawn instead of waiting for a civilized hour, and an official guide." "Because, my dear Tommy, mysteries don't wait for breakfast. Besides," she added, eyes glinting, "if we arrive before the curious villagers, we might see what others have missed." She moved deeper into the ruins, her gloved hand brushing lightly along the stonework. A bird startled from the rafters, sending down a shower of ash. The fireplace at the far end of the hall was a gaping black wound, bricks collapsed inward, and beams charred through. Yet something about its shape drew her eye. "Help me with this," she said. Tommy groaned but joined her, shifting a fallen plank aside. Beneath it, half buried in soot, lay a small metal box, its lid fused shut by heat. "Treasure chest?" he asked hopefully. "Evidence," Tuppence said, brushing it clean. "Look, welded but not destroyed." She tugged at the warped lid, wincing as her gloves smeared with soot. "Fetch that bit of iron from the doorway, will you?" Tommy obliged, and after a few determined prees, the lock gave with a reluctant crack. Inside lay a handful of blackened paper, a strip of something cloth-like, and, miraculously intact beneath the soot, a small photograph curled by age. Tuppence lifted it gingerly. "3 men," she said softly. "Uniforms. British, I think. And one of them," she frowned, "Tommy, doesn't that face look familiar?" He leaned in, squinting through the grey light. "I'll say. That's our grim friend from the portrait. Dr. Vale himself, I'd bet my last half-crown. And these others? No idea. But from their stance, I'd say comrades or co-conspirators." She turned the photograph over. Faint handwriting trailed across the back, almost erased by time. Only a few words remained legible. "In tenebris veritas." "In darkness truth," she translated aloud. Curious. "Morbid, more like," said Tommy. "Still, Latin always makes things sound terribly official. Maybe Vale was dabbling in secret societies." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Or uncovering something someone preferred to keep in the dark." Before she could say more, a sound broke the morning stillness, the crunch of footsteps on gravel outside. Both froze, instinctively glancing toward the doorway. A figure emerged from the mist, tall and broad-shouldered, his overcoat buttoned tight and a hat pulled low. For one uneasy instant, Tommy thought it was the same watcher from the village, but as the man drew closer, his expression proved brisk rather than secretive. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep, carrying authority. "I hope you have a very good reason for being here." Tuppence straightened, dusting off her gloves. "We're simply interested in the ruins, Inspector, if that's who you are." The man reached into his pocket, producing a leather case. "Inspector Graves, Hampshire Constabulary, and you are trespassing, technically speaking." Tommy adopted his most harmless smile. "Apologies, Inspector, we're just visitors. Couldn't resist taking a look before the place is closed off." Graves's eyes moved over them both, keen, measuring, but not unfriendly. "Visitors with soot on their hands and a metal box at their feet." "Pure coincidence," said Tuppence brightly. "It rolled toward us, terribly forward of it." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Graves's mouth. "You'd be Mrs. Beresford, then, the lady from the inn. Mrs. Cotter mentioned your interest in Langley Court." Tuppence inclined her head. "We like a good mystery." "I've gathered that." He stepped closer, peering at the photograph she still held. His brow furrowed. "That's him, Dr. Vale. And the man on his left, that's Captain Ross. Served with the Royal Engineers, went missing in '45. The third," he hesitated, "could be Colonel Vernon, but if so, this is the first I've seen of them together." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. "Old comrades, you think?" "Old something," said Graves grimly. "Vale's affairs were never straightforward. If you've any sense, you'll leave the rest of this to us." Tuppence's expression was the picture of innocence. "Of course, Inspector. We wouldn't dream of interfering." He gave her a knowing look. "I've been a policeman 20 years, Mrs. Beresford. When someone says they wouldn't dream of interfering, I start expecting the opposite." He tipped his hat slightly, then strode off toward the gate. The mist swallowed him quickly, leaving only the soft echo of his boots and the faint caw of a distant crow. Tommy let out a low whistle. "Nice fellow. You'll ignore him completely, I take it?" "Naturally." She slipped the photograph and parchment into her handbag. "We're far too curious to stop now." They left soon after, the morning brightening into a thin, watery sun that made the charred stones glisten like old glass. Behind them, Langley Court loomed, ruined, yes, but alive with silent promise. By evening, Woodley Magna had returned to its sleepy rhythm. The rain had begun again, gentle but persistent, tracing silver threads down the windows of the King's Lantern. Tommy sat reading by the fire, though he had turned the same page 3 times without noticing. Tuppence, meanwhile, was writing notes in her little blue book. "Remind me what you've jotted down," Tommy said finally. "Dr. Simeon Vale, historian, missing 30 years. Photograph with 2 fellow officers. Latin phrase, in tenebris veritas. Inspector Graves, who clearly knows more than he says, and an unseen observer in the village, possibly connected." "Don't forget the box," he said. "It might have held more before the fire. Perhaps something that burned too conveniently." She nodded. All was removed before it could burn. A gust of wind rattled the panes and both looked up instinctively. The fire crackled louder, filling the brief silence. Then came another sound, a faint scrape just beyond the door. Tommy rose quietly. "Probably the inn cat." "There is no cat," whispered Tuppence. He moved to the door, opened it swiftly, and found the corridor empty. Only the smell of damp and a faint chill drifted in. Shaking his head, he closed it again. Back inside, they discovered the strangest thing of all. Tuppence's handbag lay open on the table, yet nothing inside was missing. The photograph, the parchment, the soot-stained fragment, all untouched. "Someone sending a message," Tommy said grimly. "Yes," she murmured, eyes narrowing, "that they can come and go as they please." She reached for the parchment, unfolding it once more. The Latin words seemed darker now, the ink heavier in the firelight. "In tenebris veritas." "In darkness truth," she repeated softly. "Well, Tommy, it seems someone means to keep us in the dark. The question is, why?" The fire gave a sharp hiss as a log split, sending a burst of sparks into the air. Outside, the rain thickened, whispering against the windows like voices through glass, echoes of things long burned but not forgotten. The village library of Woodley Magna was one of those quiet corners of England that seemed suspended in time. Its windows, framed by ivy and age, filtered the morning light into pale gold ribbons that lay across rows of forgotten shelves. Dust floated lazily in the still air, disturbed only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor or the soft rustle of pages being turned by unseen hands. Tuppence Beresford paused just inside the doorway, taking in the faint smell of old paper and coal dust. "Perfect," she whispered, eyes alight. "Exactly the sort of place where secrets like to hide." Tommy followed her in, removing his hat and glancing around. "I dare say they'll be easier to find if we can first locate the librarian, unless she's filed herself under missing persons." "She's probably cataloguing the Magna Carta by hand," Tuppence murmured, striding ahead. "You know how it is in these villages. Modernization is viewed as witchcraft." From behind a high desk emerged a figure that might have stepped out of a Dickens novel. Miss Drayton was tall and thin, her hair a precise shade of iron grey, coiled in a bun that looked capable of deflecting bullets. Her spectacles hung from a chain across her chest, and her expression suggested that human intrusion was a regrettable but occasionally necessary evil. "Good morning," she said, in a tone that managed to sound both polite and faintly accusatory. "May I assist you?" Tuppence offered her most disarming smile. "I hope so. We're making some inquiries about Dr. Simeon Vale. He lived here some years ago, I believe." Miss Drayton's eyes narrowed slightly behind her spectacles. "Dr. Vale," she repeated, as though testing the name for dust. "Yes. A scholar of, shall we say, eccentric interests. His work was not widely appreciated." "Then perhaps you appreciated it?" asked Tuppence brightly. Miss Drayton hesitated. "He was thorough, a man of great learning, obsessed, some said, with the notion that history repeats itself, not as farce but as crime." Tommy glanced at Tuppence. "Charming philosophy." The librarian continued, her voice lowering conspiratorially. "During the war, Dr. Vale claimed to have discovered something extraordinary. Proof, he said, that betrayal had taken root close to home. He spoke of smuggled relics, secret codes, things that were meant to have been destroyed but weren't. He called it the historian's duty to bear witness." Tuppence's pen was already moving across her notebook. "Smuggled relics? As in stolen treasures?" "British artefacts," Miss Drayton said crisply. "Removed from museums and private collections for safekeeping during the Blitz. Some were never accounted for. Dr. Vale insisted they'd been sold or traded by men of influence. He spent his last years trying to trace them back." Tommy frowned. "And Postern Lane, how does that fit in?" Miss Drayton's expression flickered. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "He said he'd found proof there. That's all I know. The proof of betrayal, he called it. I told him not to speak of such things." "Why?" asked Tuppence gently. The librarian's thin fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. "Because there are ghosts in Postern Lane," she said in a near whisper. "Not the kind that rattle chains, the kind that remember." Before Tuppence could question her further, Miss Drayton's eyes shifted toward the tall window to their left. A shadow had passed across it, slowly, deliberately. Her composure wavered. "Excuse me," she said abruptly, closing the ledger before her. "I think we've talked enough for today." Tuppence turned toward the window, but the light outside had dimmed with a sudden passing cloud, and whatever had been there was gone. "Miss Drayton," she began, "if there's something you're afraid of—" The older woman shook her head sharply. "Afraid? No, but there are things better left in the past, Mrs. Beresford. You and your husband would do well to remember that." Her tone had changed. no longer distant but almost pleading. Then she drew herself upright once more, regaining her formidable air. "Good day to you." Tommy and Tuppence exchanged glances and then, without protest, left the library. Outside, the air was damp and smelled of rain-soaked grass. The village square lay in stillness, its cottages and shop fronts muted beneath a blanket of grey mist. Tommy lit a cigarette and exhaled thoughtfully. Proof of betrayal, secret relics, and an academic who disappears. If I didn't know better, I'd say we've wandered into one of your thrillers, Tuppence. She smiled faintly. And yet, Tommy, you do know better. You've seen the same look I did. Fear, well concealed but unmistakable. He nodded. And someone outside, watching. As they descended the narrow lane from the library, the church bell struck 11, its solemn note echoing through the fog. The sound seemed to ripple across the fields and fade into Postern Lane beyond. Tuppence stopped suddenly, her hand on his sleeve. There. Through the gauzy mist, a figure stood half obscured by the churchyard gate, a tall man in a dark overcoat, his hat brim shadowing his face. He appeared to be studying them, motionless, a silhouette more than a person. Tommy's tone was low. "Our friend again." Tuppence's eyes gleamed. "Good. I was beginning to think he'd given up on us." They crossed the road at a steady pace, not too hurried, not too obvious. But the moment their feet touched the cobblestones of the church path, the figure turned and moved off. "Quickly," Tuppence said, and they followed. The chase was quiet, more a pursuit through silence than through sound. The lane curved gently between hedgerows, the mist thickening so that trees became mere ghosts. At intervals they glimpsed him ahead, that same dark outline, moving with purpose. Once Tommy thought he heard the faint scrape of boots on gravel just around the bend. Then they reached the postern gate. It stood ajar, a simple wooden arch set into the crumbling wall of the churchyard. Beyond it lay the ancient graves, their stones mottled with moss. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and age. "He's gone," Tommy said quietly. "Not gone," Tuppence murmured. "Just vanished in the fog. There's a difference." She stepped closer, her eyes catching a dull glimmer near the gatepost. A small brass plaque, half hidden by ivy, was fixed there. She brushed the leaves aside. The inscription was short, the letters worn but legible, "For those who served in silence." Tuppence read it aloud, her voice soft but steady. "Cryptic," said Tommy. "Could mean the clergy, or the intelligence service, or the parish gardeners." She smiled faintly. "Or all three." Her gaze lingered on the plaque, thoughtful. "Dr. Vale served, didn't he, during the war?" "Yes. Intelligence branch, according to the inspector." Then perhaps he knew others who served in silence. Perhaps this place was more than a churchyard to him. They stood there for a long moment, the only sound the slow drip of rain from the branches above. Finally Tommy said, "Well, we can't interrogate ghosts. What now?" Tuppence looked back toward the village. "We find out what Vale was really researching. Those relics, those codes. Someone's gone to great lengths to keep them buried. And if this mysterious friend of ours keeps following us, I'd rather find out why before he decides to stop being shy." Tommy's expression softened, despite the unease flickering beneath. "You know, you have a terrible habit of sounding delighted by danger." "Only because it's never dull," she replied. As they began walking back toward the King's Lantern, the mist closed behind them like a curtain. Far off, a crow cawed from the steeple, its cry echoing across the lane where the brass plaque gleamed faintly in the dim light, silent witness to the secrets that slept beneath the soil of Postern Lane. The cottage stood at the far edge of the village, half hidden beneath a tangle of climbing roses that had long since declared independence from their trellis. The gates sagged, the gravel path was green with moss, and yet the place had an undeniable grace, like an aging actress refusing to surrender her poise, even as time insisted on rewriting her lines. Tuppence Beresford paused just outside the garden, breathing in the scent of late roses heavy with dew. "A widow's garden," she murmured. "Still beautiful but overgrown, like a memory that doesn't quite fade." Tommy glanced at her sidelong. "You're growing poetic again. Dangerous sign. Usually means you're about to interrogate someone under the pretense of friendship." "Not interrogate," said Tuppence primly. straightening her gloves. Simply converse. Tea, sympathy, and the occasional devastating insight. She lifted the knocker, a brass rose with its petals dulled by age, and rapped twice. The door opened after a moment, revealing a woman whose elegance had outlasted youth. Mrs. Edith Vale had silver hair swept neatly back, fine bones, and eyes that carried both gentleness and unhealed sorrow. She was dressed in black, though her blouse had lace at the collar, a widow's modest concession to beauty. "Mrs. Beresford?" she asked softly. Tuppence smiled warmly. "Yes, and this is my husband, Thomas. We're terribly grateful you agreed to see us." "You said it concerned my husband's work," Edith replied. "I can't imagine why anyone would still care about it, after all these years. But please, do come in." The sitting room they entered was tidy but faintly austere. Lace curtains filtered the afternoon light. A clock ticked discreetly on the mantel, and a tea tray waited by the hearth, steam curling from the pot. Yet beneath the domestic calm lay a tension that seemed almost audible. Tuppence settled gracefully into a chair. "We came across something while looking into the fire at Langley Court," she began. "A photograph. 3 men in uniform, one of them your husband." Edith Vale's hand paused halfway to the teacups. "I see," she said quietly. "So even the fire couldn't destroy everything." Tommy exchanged a look with Tuppence. "You knew it was deliberate, then?" Mrs. Vale gave a faint, humourless smile. "I didn't say that, but my husband believed that the past never stays buried. When I heard about the fire, I thought perhaps the past had decided to dig itself up." She poured the tea, her movements careful, precise. Simeon's research was not, how shall I say, popular. During the war, he worked for the War Office, cataloguing historical documents and codes. Afterward, he continued his work privately. He said he was writing a book, but I think now it was something more like a confession. Tuppence leaned forward slightly. "A confession of what?" Edith's gaze flicked toward the window, where a thin drizzle had begun to mist the glass. "He believed that during those chaotic years, certain men of position, had used the war to enrich themselves. Artifacts, archives, even state papers vanished under the excuse of bombardments. Simeon said he could trace them. He had proof." "And proof," murmured Tommy, "is a dangerous possession." "Yes." Her voice was almost a whisper. "He said that once truth is written down, it must either be destroyed or revealed, and if one cannot do either, then it destroys the keeper." Tuppence's teacup rattled softly in its saucer. "Did he tell you what he found? Where he hid it?" Edith hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "He told me very little." "By then we were living apart," Edith said, with a small, controlled breath. "He wouldn't have me at Langley Court after 44. I stayed on at the cottage. He wouldn't let me read it. Only once, the night before he disappeared, he said, 'If anything happens to me, remember, the truth sleeps in Postern Lane.'" Tommy frowned. "He vanished 30 years ago, didn't he?" "Yes. One evening he went out for a walk. He often walked after supper, and never returned. They searched, of course. The police were very kind, but there was no trace. His shoes were found by the river, but not him. They said he must have slipped and drowned. I never believed it." There was a silence then, broken only by the faint patter of rain and the steady tick of the clock. Tuppence spoke gently. "Do you think he was killed?" Edith looked up sharply. "I think he was silenced." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then she rose abruptly and crossed to the mantel. "He wasn't a brave man, my husband, but he had courage of a peculiar sort, the courage to keep digging when everyone told him to stop." Her voice trembled. "This is all I have left of him." On the mantel stood a small brass medal, polished bright. Tommy stepped closer to look. It was an old military commendation, its ribbon faded. Around the edge ran a motto, "In tenebris veritas." Tuppence caught her breath. "The same words from the parchment," she whispered. Edith turned, surprise flickering across her face. "You've seen that phrase before?" "In your husband's box. It was written beside the photograph." For the first time, true alarm entered her expression. "Then you must be careful. If that box survived, others may know it too. There are still people who would rather see the truth remain buried." Tommy's voice was steady. "Have you had any visitors lately, Mrs. Vale? Anyone asking questions?" Her hands tightened on the back of a chair. 2 days ago, a man came, tall, in a dark coat. He said he was from the Historical Society in London, but there was something wrong about him. He knew too much. When I asked for his credentials, he left abruptly. Tuppence's eyes met Tommy's. "Our friend from the village," she said softly. The clock struck 5, its chime cutting through the tension like a thin blade. Mrs. Vale sank into her chair again, visibly shaken. "I wish I'd burned it all after Simeon disappeared. The papers, the notes, everything. But part of me still hopes someone will finish what he began." Tuppence reached across, laying a hand over hers. "Perhaps someone will." When they left, the rain had stopped, and the evening was wrapped in a cool, bluish haze. The roses outside the cottage glistened with droplets, and the village lamps had begun to glow faintly through the mist. Tommy paused at the gate. "Did you notice her mantle?" "Of course," said Tuppence. "The medal, the motto." "No, I mean the dust on everything except the mantle. Someone's handled that medal recently, often I'd say. She might be polishing it for comfort, but somehow I doubt it." "You think she's hiding something?" "I think she knows more than she said." He looked back toward the cottage, where a single light now burned behind the curtains. "And if she's right about that list, someone else knows she knows." They walked in silence for a while, the wet gravel crunching beneath their shoes. The road back to the King's Lantern curved past the churchyard, where the mist gathered thickly among the stones. The air was cool and damp, and a faint smell of wood smoke drifted from somewhere unseen. Tuppence shivered slightly. "It feels watchful." Tommy smiled faintly. "That's the English countryside for you, always listening in." They reached the inn just as darkness deepened to blue-black. Inside, Mrs. Cotter was banking the fire, and a few locals lingered over their pints. The Beresfords ate a simple supper by the hearth, but conversation was sparse. Both were lost in thought. Later, as they climbed the narrow stairs to their room, the quiet of the inn seemed almost oppressive. Outside, the wind had risen again, rattling the shutters. Tuppence undid her hair in silence, then said softly, "If Vale really had that list, names of traitors, proof of betrayal, perhaps someone's been guarding it all this time." Tommy nodded. "And guarding can turn to killing if necessary." He crossed to the window, drawing the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The village lay still, the cobblestones glistening faintly under the lamplight. For a moment, he thought he saw a movement near the lane, a darker shadow against the dark, but then it was gone. "Well?" asked Tuppence quietly. "Nothing," he said. "Probably just the wind." But a moment later, the night split open with the sound of a single gunshot. It came from the direction of Postern Lane. Tuppence gasped, clutching his arm. "Tommy!" He was already moving, coat in hand. "Stay here," he said sharply. "Not a chance," she said, following him down the stairs. They ran through the square, their footsteps echoing in the wet silence. At the edge of the lane, a lantern flickered. Inspector Graves, grim-faced and solid in his raincoat. He raised a hand as they approached. "Best stay back," he said. "A vagrant by the looks of him. Shot clean through the chest. No one saw who fired." "Good Lord," murmured Tommy. "Robbery?" Graves shook his head. "No, nothing taken. But this was in his pocket." He held out a small, crumpled scrap of paper. Under the lantern light they saw it clearly, a torn corner of a photograph, showing the edge of a uniform and part of a familiar face. Tuppence felt the world tilt slightly. "That's the same photograph, the one from Langley Court." Graves nodded grimly. "Then I'd say whatever Dr. Vale stumbled on 30 years ago, someone's still willing to kill for it." The mist closed in again, swallowing the lane, the body, and the echoes of the shot, until only the faint glimmer of the inspector's lantern remained, like a lone candle flickering against the dark. The bells of St. Jude's had just finished striking 11 when Tuppence Beresford turned into the narrow path that led to the churchyard. The morning air held a cool edge. Mist clung to the gravestones, softening their shapes into half-seen sentinels. Overhead, crows wheeled lazily, their cries echoing across the sloping fields beyond. Tuppence pulled her coat tighter. She'd chosen a sensible grey hat that morning, less for fashion and more for anonymity. Inspector Graves had mentioned that Mrs. Peg Thorne, the former housekeeper of Langley Court, wasn't keen on strangers, and Tuppence, having dealt with enough village reticence to last a lifetime, knew how to tread lightly. The church door creaked as she entered. Inside, the air smelled faintly of candle wax and damp stone. Dust motes drifted through the coloured shafts of light from the stained glass windows, where saints watched her with serene disinterest. Near the chancel, a woman knelt, polishing a brass memorial plaque with slow, deliberate strokes. "Mrs. Thorne?" The woman looked up sharply, her eyes wary beneath the rim of her black hat. She was small and bent, her hands gnarled from years of labour. But there was something in her face, a sharpness dulled by fear, like a knife that had seen too much use. "I'm not buying anything," she said defensively. "I should hope not," Tuppence replied with her most winning smile. "The church would hardly approve of commerce at the altar." That earned her a brief twitch of amusement, and the woman rose stiffly. "You're not local." "No, I'm not. My husband and I are staying at the King's Lantern. We're interested in Langley Court, Dr. Vale's old home. You knew him well, I believe." Mrs. Thorne hesitated. "I kept his house, if that's what you mean, a long time ago." "I imagine it must have been," said Tuppence gently. "But memories like that don't fade easily, especially when they end badly." Peg Thorne's hands tightened on her polishing cloth. "Who told you to come?" "No one. We found something that belonged to Dr. Vale, a photograph. It led us to some questions." The old woman's eyes flickered, as though measuring the risk. "You shouldn't go poking in things that don't concern you, miss. It's not safe. Not for anyone." "I'm rather used to unsafe things," said Tuppence lightly. "They seem to like me." For a moment, Peg looked at her, as though trying to decide whether to send her away or unburden herself at last. The tension broke with a long sigh. "It was the last night he lived," she said quietly. "That's what you want to know, isn't it?" "Yes." He was upset. I'd never seen him that way before, always so calm, so proper. But that night he was pacing the floor, shouting into the fire. I was in the kitchen, pretending to polish silver, but I heard him plain as anything. "What was he shouting?" "Something about betrayal, about the war not ending when people said it did. He said, 'They think it's buried forever, but I've found it. I've found what they buried under the orchard.'" Tuppence's heart quickened. "The orchard? Behind the house?" "Yes. I didn't think much of it then. I thought he'd gone queer from all his books. But there was a knock at the door, and when I looked out, there was a man there, in uniform." "What kind of uniform?" She frowned, searching her memory. "Army, I think. But old. Not a young man's uniform, like one kept in a trunk too long." They went into the study, and the shouting started again. Then later, silence. In the morning, the doctor was gone, and that man with him. "You told the police?" "Of course I did. But they said I was imagining things, that I'd had too much to drink. They all knew Peg Thorne liked her sherry," she said bitterly. "No one believed me. They never do." Tuppence reached out, her tone softening. "But you're certain about what you heard?" "Certain enough to have nightmares every night since. I've seen his face, you know. That man. Twice since the war ended." Tuppence's pulse gave a jolt. "You've seen him since?" Peg nodded, lowering her voice. "Once in the churchyard, just after dusk, standing by the Postern gate, watching. And again, last week, near the ruins after the fire. He hasn't aged a day." "That's impossible," Tuppence murmured. The woman's expression darkened. "I didn't say it was possible. I said it was true. They call them the Watchers, the ones who keep secrets from staying buried. You can't fight men like that." "You can, if you know what they want," said Tuppence. Peg Thorne shook her head violently. "No, I've said too much already. You should leave now, Mrs. Beresford. Go back to London. Forget you ever came here." "But Mrs. Thorne," the woman backed away, clutching her cloth like a talisman. "They'll hear you asking questions. They always do." And with that, she turned and hurried down the side aisle, her footsteps fading into the hollow stillness of the church. Tuppence stood for a moment, frowning at the shadows. Then she left, the heavy wooden door creaking shut behind her. Outside, the mist had lifted into a thin drizzle. She made her way down the path, her thoughts racing. What they buried under the orchard. The phrase echoed in her mind. Vale's photograph, the Latin motto, the hidden list. It was all weaving together, though the pattern was not yet clear. She reached the corner of the churchyard when the sharp growl of an engine made her pause. A motorcar was coming fast down the narrow lane, far too fast for the slick cobbles. She turned, and froze. The car, a black saloon, was hurtling straight toward her. For an instant she saw the glint of the driver's goggles through the rain-smeared windscreen. Then instinct took over. She leapt sideways, her shoulder striking the church wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The car roared past, missing her by inches, and vanished around the bend. "Tuppence!" Tommy's voice came from up the lane. He had been on his way from the inn, coat collar up, umbrella in hand. He reached her in seconds, his face pale. "Good heavens, what happened?" She straightened shakily. "An automobile nearly ran me down." He looked back toward the road, jaw set. "Deliberately?" "Oh, undoubtedly." The driver didn't even slow. "Did you see him?" "Only that he wasn't local, too polished, and—" She hesitated. He knew what he was doing. Tommy crouched, scanning the wet ground. "There's something here." He picked up a half-soaked envelope from the gutter, its edge muddy, the handwriting elegant but hurried. He turned it over. "Addressed to C.V. London. Ring any bells?" Tuppence's eyes widened. "Colonel Vernon! The name Inspector Graves mentioned, the man in the photograph with Dr. Vale. Then it seems our mystery has just acquired a new player." He slipped the envelope carefully into his pocket, offering her his arm. "Come on, old thing. Let's get you warm before the next motor car decides to collect both of us." They walked back through the square in silence. The village had its Sunday hush about it, doors closed, curtains drawn, the faint smell of coal smoke hanging in the damp air. But beneath the calm, Tuppence felt something else, the unease of unseen eyes. At the King's Lantern, the fire in the parlour was burning low. Mrs. Cotter fussed about, bringing hot tea and a blanket, while Tommy examined the envelope by lamplight. The seal had been broken, but whatever letter it once held was gone. Only the faint imprint of folded paper remained, and a smear of ash along the edge. Tuppence watched him closely. If Vale sent something to Colonel Vernon before he died, something dangerous, it might have passed through many hands. "Or never reached him at all," Tommy said. "Maybe someone intercepted it. And if that someone's still alive, then they're desperate," she finished. He met her gaze. "You think the car was meant to frighten you off?" "Or silence me. Mrs. Thorne warned about the watchers." Tommy poured her a cup of tea, his voice lighter but his eyes serious. Then it settled. "You'll stay indoors for at least an hour while I talk to Graves." She arched an eyebrow. "You've known me how long, Tommy? You might as well ask the Thames to flow backward." He smiled wearily. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Tuppence leaned back, gazing into the fire. The flames danced over the coals, painting the walls in flickering gold and shadow. "I don't believe the answer lies in London," she said softly. "Whatever Vale found, whatever he buried, it began here, in Postern Lane, and until we dig it up, no one's safe." Outside, the wind rose, shaking the inn's shutters. Somewhere down the lane, a motor-car engine started again, softly this time, almost idling, as if the village itself were listening, waiting for what would happen next. The night had the sort of chill that seeped into one's bones and refused to leave. The fog had rolled down from the hills like a slow tide, pressing itself against the windows of the King's Lantern and curling through the lanes of Woodley Magna until the village seemed more ghost than place. Tommy Beresford stood by the inn's hearth, staring into the flames as if the answers to all their questions might be hiding in the embers. "I still say we should have waited for daylight," he muttered. Tuppence, fastening the buttons of her coat with brisk determination, smiled faintly. "Daylight is overrated, darling. All it ever does is make mysteries less mysterious." Tommy turned. "Yes, but it also makes traps visible, and floors solid." "Then we'll tread carefully." She picked up the lantern Graves had lent them earlier. "Mrs. Thorne's story, the motor car, the envelope to C.V., it all leads back to Postern Lane. And where does Postern Lane lead? The church." Tommy sighed but followed, because history had taught him that arguing with Tuppence was like trying to reason with gravity. Outside, the fog swallowed them at once. The beam of their lantern made only a small golden bubble in the greyness. The cobblestones glistened with dew, and the village slept behind shuttered windows. They reached St. Jude's by way of the Lich Gate, its timbers slick with damp moss. The church rose before them, a hulking shape of stone and shadow. The clock in the tower gave a slow, solemn tick, as though marking time for something ancient and waiting. Inside, the air was colder still. Candles flickered on the altar, their light trembling against the carved angels that lined the choir stalls. Somewhere in the rafters a pigeon stirred. Tuppence lowered the lantern, letting its glow sweep across the floor. "It's strange," she whispered. "This place feels alive somehow." Tommy knelt beside her, studying the flagstones. Alive perhaps, but uneven. "Look here, these stones are newer." He ran his hand over the seams of the stone nearest the postern door. Unlike the others, which were smooth with centuries of wear, this one was faintly raised, and the mortar around it cracked. "Stand back," he said, levering at the edge with his pocket-knife. The stone shifted, groaned, and then, with a scrape of ancient dust, lifted free. Beneath it darkness yawned, narrow and breathless. "Well," Tuppence said softly, "that's an invitation if ever I saw one." Tommy peered down. A narrow stair led into the earth, cut into stone, the walls slick with moisture. The smell that rose up was thick with age, mould, earth, and the faint metallic tang of decay. "Ladies first," he said. "Nice try," said Tuppence. "You go ahead. I'll be right behind you to admire the view." He grunted, lowered the lantern into the hole, and began his descent. The steps were steep and irregular, and each one sent a faint echo into the dark. Tuppence followed close, the beam of the lantern quivering with each movement. At the bottom, the passage opened into a low-vaulted chamber. The ceiling dripped with condensation, and carved stone niches lined the walls, some still holding ancient coffins, others empty, their lids displaced by time. The air was heavy, thick with silence. Tommy lifted the lantern. "A crypt," he murmured. "I'd say 17th century, possibly older." "Or possibly a very good hiding place," Tuppence replied. Her gaze swept the room. "Look, there." In the far corner, half concealed by fallen debris, stood an iron chest. It was nearly identical to the one they'd found among the ruins of Langley Court. Same shape, same ornate hinges. But this one was whole, its lock intact. They crossed the uneven floor cautiously. The chest was cold to the touch, its surface speckled with rust but solid. Tuppence knelt, brushing off the dust from its lid. "If this is another decoy, I shall lose all faith in narrative symmetry." Only one way to find out. Tommy's hand found the latch, and to their surprise, it opened easily. Inside lay a small stack of papers, carefully wrapped in waxed cloth, and 3 tarnished medals resting on a velvet lining. The medals were engraved with familiar Latin words, "In tenebris veritas." Tuppence drew in her breath. The same motto. It must have been Vale's personal creed. "Or his warning," said Tommy. He unwrapped the papers, revealing a small diary, its leather cover marked with age. The name inside was unmistakable, Dr. Simeon Vale. Tuppence's hands trembled slightly as she turned the first page. The handwriting was cramped but legible. Operation Caliban. Initiated February 1943. Conceived under duress of secrecy. 3 names, mine among them, bound by oath and knowledge. Treachery discovered, silence demanded. I have kept the record, for truth must out, though darkness guards it. "Operation Caliban," Tommy murmured. "Sounds delightfully ominous." Tuppence read on, her voice low and tense. The relics were never relics. They were evidence, documents stolen under guise of salvage, proof that men of honour had bartered national trust for gold. If these pages survive, they must not be found together with the list. God forgive me if I fail. She closed the book, her expression grave. 3 names, she said softly. Vale, Ross and Vernon, the men in the photograph. And one of them turned traitor. Or all 3, Tuppence said. A sound broke the silence, a faint scrape of stone behind them. Tommy swung around, the lantern beam slicing through the gloom. A figure stood in the archway, tall, motionless, a revolver gleaming faintly in his hand. The same stranger who had haunted their steps since the first day in the village. "Step away from the chest," he ordered, his voice calm but edged with menace. "Slowly," Tuppence straightened. "I must say you have an unfortunate sense of timing. We were just about to leave." "Leave," he said coldly, "and forget everything you've seen." Tommy's tone was mild. "I'm afraid that's not our strong suit." The man's finger tightened on the trigger. "I said, step away." The moment stretched taut. The lantern flame flickered in the draught, throwing monstrous shadows on the walls. Then, in one swift motion, Tommy hurled the lantern sideways. It struck the stone floor, the flame sputtering but not dying, and as the man's gaze darted toward it, Tommy lunged. The revolver went off, the shot deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck a pillar, sending a spray of stone dust into the air. Tuppence ducked instinctively, grabbing the fallen lantern before it rolled into the corner. "Tommy!" "I've got him," Tommy grunted. The two men grappled, their figures locked in the uncertain half-light. The stranger was strong, but desperation lent Tommy speed. He caught the man's wrist, twisted hard, and the revolver clattered to the floor. "Get the gun!" Tommy shouted. But before Tuppence could move, another voice rang out, firm, commanding. "Stand down, all of you!" Inspector Graves appeared in the archway, a flashlight cutting through the gloom, the beam landing squarely on the stranger's face. The man froze. Then, with a sudden shove, he broke free of Tommy's grip, striking out hard. Graves lunged, but the stranger was already moving, up the steps into the shadows beyond. His footsteps echoed once, twice, and were swallowed by the fog above. Tommy wiped his brow, breathing hard. "You certainly know how to make an entrance, Inspector." Graves holstered his weapon. "You're lucky I was tailing you. I had a feeling you'd ignore my advice." Tuppence, lantern in hand, gave him a look of exaggerated innocence. "We were simply sightseeing." "Indeed. And what did you find in your sightseeing?" Tommy gestured to the open chest. "Vale's diary. Operation Caliban. Proof of something very ugly indeed." Graves crouched beside the chest, scanning its contents. His face hardened. "I'll need to take these. They're official evidence now." "Of course," said Tuppence, "but I do hope you'll let us finish the story. We've rather a stake in it, you know." He hesitated, then nodded curtly. "You've earned that much. But be careful, Mrs. Beresford. Whoever that man is, he's not finished." Tommy frowned. "You saw him clearly?" "Clear enough to know he's trained and dangerous." The inspector's light swept across the walls, catching the inscription carved faintly above the alcove where the chest had been hidden. The words were Latin, worn but still legible. Veritas in umbra manet. Tuppence translated softly. "Truth remains in shadow." They climbed the steps in silence, emerging once more into the cold night air. The fog had thickened, curling around the gravestones like smoke. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and the echo of hurried footsteps faded into nothing. At the gate, Tommy paused, glancing back at the dark outline of the church. "He shouted something as he ran," he said slowly. "You'll hang for this, Beresford." Tuppence turned to him, her eyes bright in the lantern glow. "Then he knows your name." He smiled grimly, "which makes him either very confident or very careless." Graves's voice cut through the mist. "Whichever it is, Mr. Beresford, you've just made yourself a marked man, and until we catch him, I suggest you both keep your wits about you." The three of them stood in the churchyard, the fog weaving its silent patterns around them. Above, the bell tower loomed, its cross lost in cloud. The air carried the faint metallic scent of gunpowder and damp stone. Tuppence reached for Tommy's arm. "He said we'd hang," she murmured. "That means he thinks we've already taken something worth killing for." Tommy looked out toward Postern Lane, vanishing into darkness. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time we found out exactly what Dr. Vale died to protect." And somewhere in the fog, unseen but not unfelt, a shadow paused, watching them still. The rain in London had the kind of persistence that felt personal, thin and needling, clinging to collars and spirits alike. By the time the Beresfords' train pulled into Paddington, the city was swathed in a damp grey melancholy that suited the mood of their case rather too well. Tuppence adjusted her hat, eyeing the wet pavements beyond the cab window. "London," she sighed. "Even the fog looks suspicious." Tommy grinned faintly as their taxi jolted into motion. "After Hampshire's ghosts, I'll take suspicious fog any day. At least it stays put." She wasn't listening. Her mind was already 2 steps ahead. "Colonel Vernon," she murmured. "CV, the initials on the envelope. War hero, museum director, and one of Dr. Vale's old associates. I wonder how many secrets one can fit between a medal and a handshake." The taxi wound its way through the drizzle-slick streets, passing the grey bulk of government buildings and the muted pulse of London life. Their destination loomed soon enough, the British Museum, vast and impassive beneath its pillars, its lamps glowing faintly through the rain like watchful eyes. Inside, the hush was immediate, the kind of silence that felt cultivated over centuries. Footsteps echoed lightly on marble floors, and the air smelled faintly of dust and polish. A young attendant guided them through the galleries, past glass cases of antiquities that seemed to lean toward the visitors like eavesdropping ghosts. Finally, they were shown into a smaller, wood-panelled office at the far end of a corridor where the scent of old paper and pipe smoke lingered. Colonel Charles Vernon rose from behind his desk with a genial smile. He was a man of 60, still broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair and eyes that had once commanded obedience. His handshake was firm, but Tuppence noted, with the kind of precision born of habit, that his left hand trembled slightly before he tucked it away. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," he said warmly. "A pleasure. Inspector Graves telephoned ahead. You've been stirring up quite the archaeological interest down in Hampshire." "Only by accident," said Tommy. "We seem to trip over mysteries wherever we go." Vernon laughed politely and gestured to the leather chairs opposite. "A habit that must be both profitable and exhausting. I understand you've come across the name Simeon Vale." Tuppence's expression was mild. "We have, yes. You knew him?" "Oh, very slightly," said Vernon with a dismissive wave. "We served on a committee together during the war, museum preservation mostly. Bright fellow, if a little intense, but that was a long time ago." "Dr. Vale's research seems to have been unusual," said Tuppence. "He mentioned something called Operation Caliban. Does that ring a bell?" The Colonel's smile faltered. His gaze shifted momentarily toward the fire, then back. "Can't say it does. Sounds rather dramatic. Vale did like his theatrics." "And the phrase, in tenebris veritas?" It was almost imperceptible, the way his fingers tightened on the armrest, the faint tremor that passed through his jaw before he forced another smile. "Latin, of course. In darkness, truth. Typical of Vale's romantic nonsense. He fancied himself a philosopher." "Not a motto you'd adopt yourself?" asked Tuppence lightly. "Good heavens, no. I prefer my truths in daylight." She smiled sweetly. "How fortunate for you." For a fraction of a second, something hard and wary flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by geniality as he rose to refill his pipe. "Well, my dear Mrs. Beresford, you'll forgive an old soldier if I can't help you much. Those days were buried long ago." Tommy's tone was casual. "As long ago as the orchard behind Langley Court?" Vernon froze, not visibly, but perceptibly, like a photograph held too still. The faint scratch of his match faltered. Then he chuckled, though the sound lacked ease. "Inspector Graves has been talking out of turn, I see." "Not a word," said Tuppence pleasantly. "But Hampshire gossip travels faster than one might think." The Colonel inclined his head. "Then I'll offer some advice. Don't chase ghosts, Mr. Beresford. They tend to resent the company." A polite dismissal followed, and within minutes they found themselves back on the museum steps, rain pattering on the pavement. Tuppence drew a deep breath. "He knows something, Tommy." "He knows everything," Tommy replied, "and he's lying through his very distinguished teeth." She nodded grimly. "The tremor in his hand when I mentioned the Latin motto. He's frightened, not of us, but of what Vale left behind." They made their way to a small tea shop near Bloomsbury, where the air smelled of coffee and damp umbrellas. As they took their seats, a familiar figure appeared at their table, Inspector Graves in plain clothes and a mood of dry irritation. "You should have waited for me," he said, removing his hat. "Vernon's not a man to take lightly." Tuppence poured tea with perfect calm. "We're not taking him lightly, we're taking him suspiciously." Graves leaned in. "He was investigated once, you know, late in the war, a smuggling ring, stolen documents, museum pieces. The case was buried when his superiors decided a scandal might be inconvenient." Tommy frowned. "And Vale was involved?" Graves nodded. "Vale uncovered it. Too clever for his own good. Before he could go public, he vanished, officially drowned." "So Vernon had motive," Tuppence said. "Reputation, perhaps career." "And opportunity," added Graves. "They were working side by side. Vale trusted him." Tommy's hand rested on his coat pocket. The coded pages from Vale's diary, the ones from the crypt. They mention catalogue numbers, museum items. Could those numbers correspond to artifacts Vernon's responsible for? Graves's eyes narrowed. Let's find out. That evening, under Graves's quiet arrangement, they returned to the museum, after hours. The corridors were dim, lit only by scattered lamps that threw long shadows across marble floors. The air seemed thicker, every footstep amplified in the cavernous space. Tuppence held the lantern steady while Tommy compared Vale's codes to the small brass tags on the displays. A257, A259. Here, look. He stopped before a vast oil painting of a naval scene, the gilt frame ornate enough to house a secret or two. Below it, the tag read A260. Tuppence checked the code list. That's one of them. But what could a painting have to do with wartime smuggling? Tommy traced his fingers along the inner edge of the frame. Perhaps it's what's behind the art that matters. The frame gave the faintest creak beneath pressure. He pressed again, and with a reluctant click, a small section swung outward, revealing a recess no larger than a writing box. Inside lay a sealed envelope, brittle with age, its surface marked in ink. To be opened only by truth. Tuppence's voice was a whisper. Vale's hand, it must be. Tommy reached for it, but a sound stopped him cold. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the gallery. "Bravo," said a voice. "I wondered how long it would take you to find it." They turned. Colonel Vernon stood at the far end of the room, flanked by two men in dark suits. His expression was genial again, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Tuppence straightened. "You do enjoy an entrance, Colonel." "I find it saves time," he replied. "You've done me a service, Mrs. Beresford. I've been searching for that envelope for 30 years. Tommy's hand inched toward his coat pocket, where the small revolver Graves had insisted he carry rested. "Dr. Vale hid it from you, didn't he?" Vernon's tone hardened. Vale was a fool. He thought truth would save him. He didn't understand that truth destroys careers, nations, men. "And you?" Tuppence asked. "What does it destroy for you?" He stepped closer, eyes fixed on the envelope. "My past, Mrs. Beresford, and yours, if you meddle further." The two men moved forward. Tommy's stance shifted, calm but ready. "I should warn you, Colonel, I'm not averse to roughing up national heroes." Vernon gave a soft laugh. "I'd rather you didn't. I dislike mess." From the shadows near the doorway, a voice interrupted. "Then perhaps we'll keep things tidy." The men froze. Inspector Graves stepped into view, revolver drawn. "Evening, Colonel. I'd say you've outstayed your welcome." Vernon's calm faltered. "You don't understand, Graves. Those papers, if they come out, they'll destroy half the War Office." "Then let them," said Graves evenly. "I'm more interested in the crimes that did happen, not the reputations that survived them." For a moment, the air was heavy with stillness, the kind that precedes either surrender or chaos. Then Vernon lunged. It was over in seconds, a shout, a scuffle, the crash of a glass case, and Graves's revolver firing once into the ceiling. Vernon's men scattered, one striking out at Tommy before bolting down the corridor. Vernon himself stumbled, his face pale. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he rasped. "You'll hang for this, all of you." Vernon wrenched free with a sudden, vicious twist and hurled a display plinth into Graves. Glass exploded. The lights shuddered. By the time Graves recovered, Vernon had vanished into the corridor fog, his men scattering after him. Tuppence, still clutching the envelope, looked down at the unbroken seal. "To be opened only by truth," she read, low. "He won't run far," Graves said grimly, already calling it in. "But until we take him, keep that safe." Outside, sirens wailed into the London mist. Two figures stood in the dim gallery light, caught for a moment between history's lies and the fragile promise of what comes after. Graves's silhouette appeared behind them. "You've done well," he said, his tone almost approving. "Keep a tight grip on that envelope. It's the heart of the matter, and the reason some people are willing to kill to keep it hidden." Tuppence's eyes caught the medals, their Latin inscriptions gleaming faintly. In tenebris veritas, in darkness, truth. She pressed her lips together, a quiet vow forming. Whatever shadows had concealed this history, They would not hold it forever. The museum doors were closed and locked behind them as they left, the fog curling in wisps around their ankles, blending with the distant hum of London traffic. Every street lamp flickered like a sentinel, guarding the secrets buried within the city's heart. As they stepped into the damp night, Tuppence glanced at Tommy. "The final pieces are coming together," she said softly. "Postern Lane, Langley Court, and now London. The truth waits at the end of all this." Tommy's expression was grim but resolute. "Then we'll give it to her. The truth, that is, and let those who betrayed us reckon with it." Somewhere in the fog, Vernon's silhouette lingered, watching, calculating, still alive with fear and intent. And somewhere in the shadows of history, Dr. Vale's secrets pressed close, waiting for justice, for revelation, and for the reckoning that had been deferred too long. The storm had gathered quickly over Hampshire, the sky a roiling canvas of steel and charcoal, lightning cleaving the clouds with savage brilliance. Rain lashed the hedgerows and churned the muddy lanes into ribbons of treacherous water. Tommy Beresford gripped the wheel of the rented car with white-knuckled intensity, his knuckles slick with rain and cold. Beside him, Tuppence's scarf whipped about her neck, her eyes fixed on the twisting lane ahead. "Do you think he knows we're coming?" Tommy shouted over the roar of the storm. Tuppence's grin was taut, determined. "If he doesn't, he will soon enough. Vernon isn't clever. He's desperate." Behind them, the distant beam of another car's headlights, Inspector Graves, cut through the curtain of rain. He kept pace without words, his silhouette a steadfast shadow in the tempest. The three moved as one, chasing a shadow through the night, drawn inexorably to Langley Court and the orchard where the past waited. The ruins of Langley Court emerged from the rain like a blackened ghost. The skeletal walls stood jagged against the sky, each beam slick with water, each gable dripping with mist. The orchard beyond quivered under the force of the wind, old apple trees bowing low, their branches clawing at the earth as though trying to reveal long-buried secrets. "Here," Tuppence said, pointing, "the old apple tree." Vale mentioned hiding something beneath the orchard. Tommy swerved to a stop, mud splattering across the tires. The ground was treacherous, sloping toward the tree where roots gnarled the soil like arthritic fingers. Lightning flashed, illuminating the orchard for an instant in blinding clarity. The twisted trunks, the soggy leaves, and at last, something glinting faintly at the base of the largest tree, the outline of a cellar door. Graves was already out of the car, boots sinking into the mud, his revolver drawn. "Careful," he called. "Could be a trap." Tuppence and Tommy followed, their own steps cautious. The rain soaked them instantly, water dripping into their collars, plastering hair to their foreheads. But the sight of the cellar door drove them onward, hearts pounding in time with the storm. Tommy knelt, brushing mud from the edge. "It's old but solid," he said. "Looks like it hasn't been opened in decades." Lightning flashed again, and the pale illumination revealed the carved initials Vale had used in his diary. Tuppence traced them with a gloved finger. "This is it. This is where he hid everything." Graves crouched beside them, nodding. "Then let's see what history has been keeping." Tommy levered the door with a crowbar Graves had produced. It resisted at first, groaning against rusted hinges, then gave way with a reluctant creak. The interior smelled of damp wood and earth, a perfume of secrets long undisturbed. The lanterns they carried revealed a small subterranean chamber. Against the back wall lay a leather file, its edges softened by age, and nearby, a grim sight, the skeletal remains of a man, twisted as if caught mid-struggle. Tommy's breath hitched. "It's him," Tuppence said quietly. "Captain Ross, Vale's third man." Graves leaned close, inspecting the bones without a trace of shock. Killed for knowledge, or left to die after betrayal. Either way, he waited long for justice. Tuppence approached the file, opening it carefully. The first pages were brittle, but the ink survived remarkably well. A list of names stared back at her, some crossed out, others marked with notes in Vale's precise hand. These were the traitors he had discovered, men of power and position, some already dead, others still influential in British society. "They knew who they were," she murmured, voice low. "And now, anyone who discovers this is a threat." Lightning struck again, the thunder shaking the orchard like the roar of a colossal beast. The wind swept across the ground, and in that moment a figure appeared at the top of the slope, soaked to the bone, hat gone, clothes plastered, revolver drawn. Vernon. "I told you," he shouted, voice hoarse. "I warned you. This list, it would destroy innocent families. You don't understand the consequences." Tommy moved forward, hands raised. "It's too late, Vernon. The truth is out. Vale's truth. Ross's truth. It can't be stopped." Vernon's hand shook violently, the barrel of the revolver quivering in the rain. You don't see. People will be ruined. Lives destroyed. I've tried to protect them. Tuppence stepped closer, holding the photograph aloft. "And you killed Captain Ross. That's what you've done. Your obsession with hiding the truth murdered him." The accusation struck Vernon like a lightning bolt. His grip faltered, eyes wide with the shock of exposure. For a heartbeat, neither of them breathed. The storm seemed to pause, listening. Then, as he stumbled backward, the mud beneath his feet gave way. He pitched, arms flailing, and the gun clattered from his grasp. Tommy lunged instinctively, but it was too late. Vernon slipped further, sliding down the slope, striking a root and rolling headfirst into the wet soil. The forested ground swallowed him entirely. A final splash in the mud, and he was gone. Tuppence stood frozen for a moment, staring at the churned earth, rain soaking her coat. Tommy came beside her, silent, the wind whipping around them. Graves approached, hand on his revolver, but expression grim. "He's dead," Graves said quietly. "The storm took him as much as the mud did. You can't save everyone, even desperate men." Tuppence exhaled slowly, gripping the leather file in both hands. "But we can save the truth." She opened it again, scanning the names. Each line told a story. Loyalty betrayed, duty abandoned, lives intertwined in secrecy and corruption. Some names she recognized from the wartime archives. Others were new, waiting for history to judge. Tommy looked up at the orchard. The trees bowed under the storm's final gusts. Vale hid it well. Ross paid the price. Vernon. He paid in fear, in obsession, and finally, in the mud. Graves crouched beside them. "Now it's up to you two to make sure this is handled responsibly. The file goes to the proper authorities, and the rest." He gestured toward the darkened orchard, the skeletal remains, and the slope that had claimed Vernon. "History will do the rest." Lightning split the sky once more, illuminating the orchard with a cold, sharp brilliance. The cellar door lay open, its secrets finally revealed. The skeletal figure of Captain Ross was a mute testament to Vale's foresight and Vernon's folly. Tuppence closed the file carefully, tucking it under her arm. "It's all here, Tommy. Every secret, every betrayal. Postern Lane, Langley Court, the crypt, all pieces of the same puzzle." Tommy nodded, mud splattered and soaked but resolute. "And now the puzzle is complete. The storm cleared away the shadows, literally, if not figuratively." As the first light of dawn broke over Hampshire, the storm clouds parted, leaving the village washed clean in silver and gold. The church spire gleamed in the early sun, its shadow stretching across Postern Lane, quiet and patient. The Beresfords stood in the orchard, silent, the weight of history pressing lightly upon them, yet relief threading through their exhaustion. Graves adjusted his coat, surveying the scene. "It's over," he said, though his tone carried a note of finality more personal than professional. "At last," Tuppence exhaled, letting her shoulders relax. "At last," she repeated. The file, the photograph, the coded pages, all of it safe, all of it truth. Tommy reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. "And now, finally, we can go home." The wind had died down entirely, leaving only the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds resuming their morning chorus. Postern Lane was silent, holding the echoes of decades of secrets, but for the first time, the past seemed at peace. Tuppence glanced at the orchard one last time. "Vale, Ross, you can rest now. Your truth is safe." Tommy nodded. "And we'll make sure it stays that way." The three figures, Tuppence, Tommy and Graves, turned together, leaving the orchard behind. The first rays of sunlight touched the wet cobblestones of the lane, glinting off puddles like scattered fragments of memory. The rain-soaked earth smelled fresh, a new beginning threaded through the end of an old dark story. Above, The church bells chimed the hour, a solemn yet comforting reminder that even the longest shadows eventually give way to light. London woke slowly that morning, the streets still wet from the overnight rain, lamplight catching puddles and turning them into mirrors of the grey sky above. In the Beresfords' flat on South Audley Street, the kettle whistled insistently, steam curling in lazy spirals through the kitchen. Tommy Beresford, still in his dressing gown, sat at the breakfast table, the newspaper spread wide before him. "Good morning," he said, though his tone was half sarcastic, half relieved. Or at least, as good as it can be after chasing shadows through mud, rain and fog. Tuppence, pouring tea from the freshly boiled pot, smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lifted with that mixture of amusement and contentment that always meant she was already planning her next adventure. "It's quieter than Hampshire," she remarked, setting the cups down, "and far less muddy." Tommy's eyes skimmed the headlines, landing on the one that made him sit up straighter. "Langley Court tragedy solves wartime mystery," he read aloud. "Well, it seems the newspaper's finally caught up with us. Graves's note arrived with the Morning Post. The vagrant carried an old War Office canteen stamp. Not vagrant, runner. Someone tried to pass a sliver of the photograph back into the world and paid for it." Tuppence set the photograph they had recovered beside the teapot, still damp from the rain outside. "I suppose they'll never know the half of it," she said. "The names, the details. Scotland Yard insisted we keep some things confidential. It seems even the press has its limits." Tommy's eyebrows lifted. "And yet, they still make us look like heroes. That's what counts. Brief glory before being forgotten again, eh?" Tuppence chuckled. "Brief, perhaps, but meaningful." She poured him a cup of tea, the steam warming the dim kitchen. "You know, truth has a way of finding its destination, Tommy. No matter how many years it gets lost in the post, no matter how deeply someone buries it." He sipped his tea, grimacing slightly at the temperature. "I'd rather truth didn't involve blood, mud, and a skeletal corpse. But yes, I'll grant you that much." "Exactly," she said. She reached for the mysterious note that had started it all, the short, anxious letter on aged paper, the one without a return address, the one that led them to Hampshire, Postern Lane, and finally to the revelations at Langley Court. She smoothed it gently, then opened their scrapbook labelled Adventures of the Blunt Agency and carefully folded the note into a corner. "There," she said softly, "history preserved, adventures remembered. It deserves a place alongside the others, the cases, the close calls, and the occasional bullet." Tommy leaned back, his chair creaking. "Next time," he said with mock severity, "we answer only postcards from the seaside. No more letters like this, please. Never again from Postern Lane." Tuppence raised an eyebrow, amused. "You say that now, darling, but the call of mystery is always stronger than common sense." The morning light filtered in through the curtains, turning the steam from the kettle into a haze that gave the kitchen a golden glow. Outside, London was resuming its normal rhythm. Coaches rattling over cobblestones, the occasional clatter of an early milk cart, the low hum of conversations drifting from open windows. Inside, the world felt warm, safe, and complete. Scotland Yard had already expressed their gratitude privately, Graves himself delivering the message with the sort of formal relief only a seasoned officer could muster. "You did more than your share," he said, tipping his hat. "But some names must remain confidential. Understand? Lives still depend on discretion." Tuppence had nodded, her fingers tracing the embossed edges of the scrapbook. "We understand, Inspector. The world can't handle all the truth at once, but it's out there, where it belongs." Tommy sipped his tea again, more slowly this time, the warmth spreading through him. "You know, it's a pleasant change to sit down without worrying about motor cars, secret passages, or desperate colonels." Tuppence smiled, eyes following the steam spiralling from her cup. "Storms pass, Tommy. Whether in Hampshire or London, they pass. And afterward, you notice how comforting simple things become. The kettle, a cup of tea, a quiet morning." "Indeed," he agreed, glancing over the scrapbook once more. "The note that started all this. It had to reach us, didn't it? Even through decades of silence and misdirection." "Yes," she said softly, her tone reflective. "Letters, like truth, always have a way of finding their recipient, even if they must take the longest, most circuitous route." They sat for a while in companionable silence, listening to the whistle of the kettle, the faint ticking of the clock, the murmur of the city beyond their windows. Each sip of tea was a small celebration, a nod to endurance, courage, and the preservation of history in both its dark and luminous aspects. Tommy finally put down his cup and glanced at the scrapbook. "You know, Tuppence, this may be the last case for a while. Let's hope the next note we receive is far less harrowing." Tuppence laughed, a sound that mingled with the soft morning light. "Agreed. Perhaps a note about a lost cat or a missing scone, but never again about a burned manor, a hidden crypt, or the sins of war." He leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to relax. Here's to that. The rain had ceased outside. The streets glistened under the early sunlight, and the world seemed to breathe easier. The storm that had raged in Hampshire, in London, and in hearts too long burdened by secrets had finally passed. Tuppence folded her hands over her tea, gazing at the scrapbook one last time. "We did right by Vale, by Ross, and by the truth. That's all any of us can do, isn't it?" Tommy nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And the rest," he said, "we leave to history, the rain, and a good cup of tea." She lifted her cup, meeting his eyes. "To the truth, Tommy." "To the truth," he echoed. Outside, London's morning carried on undisturbed, oblivious to the shadows that had been lifted, to the secrets revealed, and to the justice finally delivered. Inside, in the warmth of their kitchen, the Beresfords sat quietly, savouring the calm that follows storms, the comfort of light, and the unspoken promise of more adventures to come, though perhaps from safer, sunnier corners of the world. And somewhere in the scrapbook, the folded note lay patiently, a testament to the passage of truth, the endurance of courage, and the knowledge that even letters lost in the post could find their way home.